In the early days of his administration, he did deliver a joint address to Congress, but tonight, as you heard, will be President Biden's first official State of the Union speech. And what is that state almost 3 years into the coronavirus pandemic and the beginning of a war in Eastern Europe? Fox 40's political analyst, Republican Tim Rosales, and Democrat Ed Emerson here with me live to take a look at these issues. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Minus Russia's invasion of Ukraine last week, this would have been a much different speech. Tim, now there has to be a focus on America's economic moves with sanctions against Russia.
Absolutely. And right now we're seeing the Biden presidency, which has, to this point, has been very reactive and defensive, I think, in the early part of his administration, and whether or not they're going to take a more proactive stance. But I think that has really defined at least these first months. Much of that is situational and has been foisted upon him by external events. But some of that I think also is part of his leadership style. It kind of, reminds me of I was too young at the time, but certainly the first term of Jimmy Carter's presidency. You had inflation out of control. You had energy crisis. You had the Soviets invaded Afghanistan during that time. A lot of those things built up during that first term of President Carter's administration. We're seeing, kind of, as history tends to do, repeat itself here in 2022. With the Biden administration. So certainly his remarks tonight, I think the American people are looking for leadership and next steps in terms of Ukraine and Russia. And I think that's going to be important. But also, I think the domestic policy you talked about, and the president has to mention inflation and inflationary prices, and pressures which are at levels we haven't seen in 40 years. High costs of everything, and that's only going up. And particularly here in California, we're seeing that kind of at a more intense rate. And
we definitely
that's critical.
are.
Yep, absolutely. And then energy independence, I think, is something that people are going to talk about as well, or want to hear about, because that is certainly one of the critical issues facing not only the country but the world right now, and part of the leverage that Russia has on countries like the U.S. and Germany and others.
Ed, let's go back to what the president might need to say tonight about sanctions. He's, been criticized for not doing enough fast enough. What does he need to say about that? And then also, what does he need to say when it comes to the inflation debate that's really been dogging him in his poll numbers?
Sure. His first step was to reconstitute the NATO and the European alliance, which he has done an extraordinary job doing. To make a decision in NATO and the European alliance, you have to get 40 people to agree to do one thing 100 times. And he's done a magnificent job, I think, in terms of reconstituting this after the diminution of NATO over the last 4 years. COVID. He's going to have to talk about 550 million vaccinations around the country, and the fact that most states, in fact, all states, are eliminating mask requirements. The Omicron and other indicators of COVID are all headed downward, and we can say we've had some success. The economy, 5.6% job growth, which unfortunately leads to inflation, and 6 million new jobs, which he has been able to put on the books. The last thing is the Supreme Court. He has nominated a new person for the Supreme Court, but I think he's got much more to do to that tonight, and it's an almost impossible task. He has to make this war in the Ukraine relevant to America. Okay. I mean, people are relevant to Americans and obviously American voters. He's got to show them that Russia's aggression and this attack on Ukraine is an attack on democracy, is an attack on our very way of life. And people need to get behind that. And I think he's doing a good job so far.
Ed, with the coronavirus that you just mentioned waning right now, the pandemic and its restrictions might not be the battering ram that Republicans might have hoped for leaning into the midterms. Hard to get people to be upset about. Some say we're overbearing mask rules when they won't have had to wear one for months. So where does that argument go now, Ed? Do they just lose something in their arsenal?
I think a little bit, yeah. I think I understand the frustration with wearing a mask. I had to go to an event the other night where we had to wear a mask the whole time, and it's frustrating, especially I'm vaccinated and boosted and all that sort of thing. I get that. I think it's time for people to let that go. I think they need to focus on the real issues confronting the world, which is this unbridled aggression by Vladimir Putin. I think it's important now to look at the science, as we have since the beginning, and people have followed that. As I mentioned before, 550 million vaccines is not a number to sniff at. And I think that people are starting to understand 900,000 Americans have died of this disease. 900,000. That's a lot of folks.
It definitely is just a staggering number. And Tim, we have to ask, so the coronavirus restrictions have been a Republican battering ram. That seems to be shrinking, let's say, the size of that battering ram. So is that something that your party is going to have to kind of abandon as we lean toward the midterms?
I think where the debate goes on those issues is more about things like parent rights, individual choice, those types of things, and making sure that that parents, when it comes to decisions about schools and classrooms and those types of things, have more of an equal partnership with their local school boards, with teachers, and that those types of decisions can be made on a local level. I think those things are going to continue to be out there and points of debate, and things that certainly I think not only Republicans but just folks in general, parents and interested parties and what happens at that level are going to be talking about. But certainly I agree with Ed. I think nothing is going to unite a country, especially the United States, like fighting the Russians. It is what we ever since the Cold War, and you look back historically. Kennedy did it, Reagan did it. You look at some of these important events in modern U.S. history of the 20th and 21st century, and it has involved these episodes with the Russian government or the previous Soviet government. And I think President Biden here tonight, I think to instill some confidence and also rally the American people and make it relevant, and I agree with Ed on that.
Okay.
Is that is something he really needs to do, and I think could make the difference between a speech that is seen as successful or one that, again, kind of goes back and puts him on the defensive or reactive
stance.
Stature. Yep.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to put a pin in it there. We are expecting the Republican response from Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, who has been very counter to the Biden administration when it comes to some of these coronavirus measures. So we'll have to see what she has to say and how the president performs. Thank you so much for your insight today. And we want to remind everybody that we right here at Fox 40 will be airing the State of the Union starting at 6 p.m. this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.